Great, thank you, Chris. We could have read the whole chapter. I wanted us particularly to be able to focus on those passages from chapter 7, so hence focusing on those. But do go and read the whole chapter at some point, because it's really good just to see how Paul works through his argument and his advice. And my title today is Mastering Our Sexuality. But as you'll see, where I really want to go with it is how do we flourish as sexual beings? And those two things are tied closely together. We planned this whole series to come immediately after Genesis 1, 2, and 3, because as Tim said last week, those chapters really set the stage and lead into this topic really, really closely. And when Jesus is asked about questions of marriage and sex, he goes straight back to Genesis 1 and 2 for his answers. And so we do well to copy his example. And I want to remind us right at the outset of the framework that Genesis sets out for us. And this is my way of phrasing it. It's not the only way, but I want to encourage us to learn this, because if we approach the scriptures like this, if we approach matters of theology like this, it will do us good, and it will help us not to make the mistake that Adam and Eve made of doubting God's character. We were created by a good and loving God to experience his goodness and the goodness of his creation in loving relationship with him. I'm going to say that once more, and I'm actually going to encourage you. You don't feel like you need to unmute, and if you're on a repeat after me person, then you're free. But I want to encourage you to put these words on your lips, because I think they're really powerful words that we have drawn out of Genesis 1 and 2 so far. So we were created by a good and loving God to experience his goodness and the goodness of his creation in a loving relationship with him. Yeah, absolutely. And whoever did decide to unmute and be brave, brilliant, well done. Excellent. So yeah, we were created by a good and loving God to experience his goodness, the goodness of his creation in a loving relationship with him. So we were created to flourish in all the ways that God made us. One of the ways is that he created us as sexual beings. And we read it right back at the beginning, man and woman, made in God's image, naked, no shame, made to flourish. But flourishing can be misinterpreted, right? We can think of flourishing as meaning superabundance all the time. And like so many areas, that's not actually what flourishing looks like. Flourishing looks like things sitting in their right place. Just to take an example that might help us, Proverbs 30, 7-9 talks about money like this. 2 things I ask of you, Lord, do not refuse me before I die. Keep falsehood and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. And then he goes on to unpack that. Otherwise, I may have too much and disown you and say, who is the Lord? Or I may become poor and steal and so dishonor the name of my God. And you see here 2 different contrasting responses to having too much and too little. Having too much of a good thing can cause us to divert ourselves from the Lord and to become self-sufficient and self-reliant. And not having enough can lead us into sin. And actually flourishing doesn't mean superabundance. It means having it in its right place. God made us to flourish as sexual beings, but that means sex sitting in its right place. In fact, God also created us as what we call holistic beings. Our bodies and our spirits work together in many ways. I don't know if you think about this. We're not just a soul that happens to have a body attached. As Christians, we don't believe that our soul floats on immortal forever after we die. Our bodies will be resurrected. We will have resurrection bodies like Christ's. So our bodies are part of us as well, and our bodies and our spirits work together. So hunger points us to our hunger for and our daily dependence on God, just as well as it points us to the fact that we need to have some food in our stomachs. Sickness and weakness in our bodies remind us of our soul's sickness and weakness. They entered creation at the same time. Sexual desire is a physical desire for intimacy, but it's also a desire for spiritual intimacy. You can read what Paul says about what happens when a man and a woman are united like that, if you want to dig more into that. This is why, as Tim laid out so clearly last week, the idea of casual sex is a fiction. So we want, as a church, for those among us who are not currently married to flourish in that station of life. We want those who are married to have healthy, strong marriages with good sex as a core component of that. We want to flourish by living rightly in relationship with God, in relationship with each other, honoring where God has placed each of us in the place we're at, and with sex neither too important nor ignored in our lives. Now, we do run into a bit of a problem when we talk about flourishing as sexual beings, and that is this, and perhaps it's put more starkly than you might have thought to do so yourself, but it is, I think, true. Almost nobody has the amount of sex that they want to. So everybody needs to learn to master their desires. You see, there are those who are single, or perhaps widowed or divorced, who don't have sex. There are spouses with differing sexual appetites from each other. So one of them is likely to often want sex and find their partner isn't as keen, while on the other hand, there will be some who sometimes choose to submit their lack of desire to their spouse's desire and have more sex than they'd choose to. Very occasionally, you find places where a couple's desires are evenly matched, but even then, that can be thwarted by illness, by children, by house guests, by busyness, by lack of time. So almost nobody actually has the amount of sex that they would choose to if it was just up to them. And I want to suggest to you, this is by design. God didn't intend it to be an on-demand, by one person's thoughts, sort of creation. We see that God has baked into physical reality, into how our bodies work, different responses between men and women. It's there by design. So I want to suggest to you that even before the fall, there could have been mismatched desires between Adam and Eve, times when one of them was more sexually interested than the other, and that wouldn't have been a fallen thing. That wouldn't have been sinful. That would just have been that same mechanic of free will that God chose to give us. It would have been love worked out in relationship, in the give and take of relationship. So, okay, pretty much everybody will experience some level of sexual frustration in their lives, either more than they want, less than they want. What do we do with that? I'm going to borrow just a little bit ahead of where we've got to in Genesis and look at Genesis 4, where Cain has offered an offering to God that's not been accepted. And God knows what's in his heart. And he says these words to him: "Even now, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it." Now, sadly, Cain doesn't go on to master it. But it is possible. God speaks that word to him. You must master it. And we are not designed to be ruled by our desires. We are not animals who are simply ruled by our desires. I loved in the Wednesday's prayer meeting, I think it was, somebody read that psalm that says, "Do not be like the horse or mule, which has to be controlled with bit and bridle." It was about seeking to understand the Lord and to choose what was right, rather than being forced to. We're designed to be beings who choose to do right, who rule in life rather than being ruled. The Bible is full of practical wisdom for how to do this. One of the things that you'll find as you read through the scriptures, and many of you will know this already, is that you can find passages which go into great depth on a particular topic, but actually sometimes stepping back and looking at the stories that come up in the histories and the teaching that comes in the epistles and the way things are laid out as good and noble in the Mosaic law and the way that it's talked about in the prophets, you sort of hold all of that together and you see a picture that doesn't necessarily come out in any individual passage. And so we will read some chapter and verse, but I'm also going to talk about principles that emerge from the sum of the scriptures. But just before we dive into that practical wisdom, I want to say this. You may have heard it said that sometimes when you think you're hungry, you're actually thirsty. Sometimes our body desires water, but because of the way that our mind relates to our body, and I don't understand this, maybe some of you do, what we actually perceive is its hunger. And if we feed the hunger, we don't actually fix the problem, which is thirst. Desire for sexual intimacy can be a desire for something else, because it was always created, again, Tim last week, as a pointer towards Christ's desire for his church and his church's desire for Christ. So I want to say that where these desires are mismatched, if there's a desire for greater sexual intimacy than we have at any given situation, station in life, And if that's a chronic thing, then actually maybe what we're really perceiving is that we desire greater closeness with the Lord. And what we're perceiving is, well, I need that intimacy, and the framework I have for that in my head is that's probably about a romantic sexual relationship. But actually, maybe it's not. Maybe what we're really longing for is to fill that God-shaped hole, for intimacy with God. Partners weren't made to fill that hole. If we have a regular desire, I'm not talking about once or twice, but a regular desire to be less intimate than our spouse desires from us, perhaps that might point to a desire to be closed down and not to be vulnerable spiritually as well. So let's make sure that we're also looking at the deeper thing, the thing beneath the thing. What is it that our appetites point to that's going on in our hearts? But okay, let's get into some practical things. I'm going to break this up into different sort of areas because actually it's quite different for different people. We all need to learn to master our desires. We all need to learn to live well with them, but that looks different for different people. For those who are currently single, now this is obviously a very broad category. There are some people who are temporarily single but are planning not to be. Brandon would be perhaps a particular example of that because you have very definite plans not to be single in the sense of, obviously you are engaged, so not single in that sense, but single in the sense of not married. It can be forever. It can be by choice. It can be because you're not yet at the age where you might get married. It could be because you've been widowed. It could be because you've been divorced. Perhaps you're just not attracted to other people that way, or perhaps you find yourself attracted to a person or people who you consider to be off limits. Someone of the same sex, or someone who isn't a believer, someone who's already married. There can be all kinds of reasons for which we can be temporarily or permanently single. And so I want to just speak to what the Bible says about this. Firstly, it's not only possible, but it is entirely plausible that we can live fulfilled lives as human beings without ever having sex. Jesus is our perfect example in this, but he is far from alone. Paul certainly lived much of his life unmarried. We don't know whether he might perhaps have been married prior to his conversion, but certainly by the time he's writing his letters, he is not married. We read about Philip the evangelist, also in Acts, who has 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. We don't know if they remained that way, but clearly at that stage in their life, they were both fulfilled and they were living effective, powerful Christian lives, and yet they were virgins. Anna in Luke 2 was married for 7 years and then lived as a widow. Well, we don't know for quite how long, but she's 86, I think it is at this time, so probably 60 or more years. And she lives this life of fasting, prayer, and worship. And she was one of the very first to recognize Jesus when he came. Now, culture often gives us a message that really you're not fulfilled unless you are having sex. And we just need to hold that up against the scriptures and say, no, that's not the case. It's plausible and possible to live fulfilled lives as human beings. In fact, the person who lived the most fulfilled human life, Jesus Christ, was a virgin right to the point of his death. But the second thing I want to say is this, and this is drawing on some advice from a friend of ours, a lady called Catherine, who she gave a talk at Oxford Community Church when she was 40 and she was single. She had desired ever since, being aware of such things, she had desired to be married. She had not found the right Christian husband, and she was talking about singleness, and her talk has really stuck with me. A number of things she said stuck with me, but she talked about embracing it. Now, some people may need no encouragement whatsoever to embrace singleness. You may well have chosen it, and you say, well, don't condescend to me. I don't need pity. I don't need to be told to embrace it. That's not my heart in this at all, absolutely. But there are some for whom singleness is very much not what you've chosen, and you see it as something you would desperately long to move beyond. And I just want to say in that, embrace the season that you are in. Catherine talked about this and said, embracing it is not the same as giving up. It's not the same as saying, I never want to be married, I'm done with this. Nor is it stopping praying, and she continued to pray for a husband at that stage. Nor was it pretending it didn't matter. She was really, really saddened that she had not found a husband. She really longed to, and it mattered to her. But she said, despite all of that, I'm still going to embrace the season I'm in for what it can bring. And in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about this. This is the passage we've just read. I'd like you to be free from concern, because an unmarried man's concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But, a married man's got to worry about his wife. I'm paraphrasing. An unmarried woman or virgin's concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit, but a married woman's got her husband to worry about. There's an undivided commitment to Christ that can be present in the life of somebody who has not got a husband or a wife to be concerned about. And I want to say, just embrace that, live it out fully, model it to others, because there's so much richness in that. There are things that you can do that somebody who has chosen to get married cannot and will not be able to do, or at least certainly not as well, and embrace it. One of the ways that Catherine went about this, and I thought this was really, really inventive, actually. She said, lots of my friends going off on weekend breaks with their husbands or their wives. She said, I went on a weekend break with God. I booked a hotel, I took my Bible, my journal, and a couple of Christian books, and I spent my time there sitting with him in prayer. She'd go out on walks and she'd marvel at creation, but she wouldn't go and see people, and she wouldn't distract herself with that. It was her and God time. And she saw that as a real treat. She saw it as time to be utterly devoted to him. Now, that may or may not work for you, but it was a way for her to embrace the season she was in. But at the same time, and Paul is really clear about this, while there is something to be embraced, nor is it wrong to want a believing spouse. It doesn't mean we're somehow not content with the Lord. And I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase bandied around, but if you hear people saying, I'm just content with me and the Lord, it can kind of imply that there's some kind of discontent if you want a spouse. Paul says, no, that's not wrong. It's not wrong to want a spouse. I mentioned a believing spouse. I'll say more about that later. The last thing that I want to draw from the scriptures, particularly with regards to our self-control and our singleness, is this: don't allow the current culture to rob you of intimacy in non-sexual, non-romantic friendship. Now, this is probably more of an issue with our youth, but I think it warrants saying all the same. True intimacy exists outside of romance and sex. David and Jonathan's probably the most obvious example of this, and you may know that at times people have tried to read into their story that they were lovers, and people have presented them as, see, this is what was going on, but actually the text doesn't allow it, and the culture wouldn't praise it. It doesn't work as an interpretation of that story. But Jonathan's deep friendship with David was expressed in a selfless love. 1 Samuel 18 says that Jonathan loved David as himself. And David sees this when he laments for Jonathan after his death. He says, your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. We could look to Jesus as well. In John 15, Jesus says, greater love hath no man than this. And he doesn't then say a man and wife. He says someone laying down their life for their friend. Jesus's ultimate ideal of selfless, self-giving love that he held up was one of a friend laying down their life for a friend. And in our culture at the moment, those waters can be muddied, because what culture often presents is that if you feel that way about somebody of the same sex, you're just attracted to people of the same sex, and that's what's going on. And actually, we mustn't allow that to rob us of true, intimate, same-sex friendships. Not only same-sex, you can have intimate, obviously, friendships with people of the opposite sex as well. But there's a particular battle to be won there, I think, about good, intimate, guy-guy, girl-girl friendships. There's more that could be said, but I'm going to move on to what about those who are married? Well, Tim gave us a great starting point last week. Sex is supposed to be about giving. That in itself is countercultural, but that comes out all the way through the scriptures, both in how sex is talked about positively, but so many times as well in how it goes wrong. And you'll notice if you read through the histories, Samuel, Kings and Chronicles, how many times sex goes wrong, and Judges as well, because people have a mindset of what they can get rather than what they can give. Song of Songs, chapter 5, gives a really powerful picture of a couple's desires not aligning. You might be familiar with the passage, but the man arrives at the house eager, and the woman's all like, oh, I'm just in bed and I don't want to get up and put my shoes on again. And she just wants to go to sleep. And by the time she's decided she's interested after all and she gets up, he's gone. And this happens in marriages. What do we do with this? What advice can we give about self-control to those who are married? Well, I want to suggest, first of all, with that mindset of being giving, let's refuse to be grumpy or bitter if an advance is turned down. And let's practice giving ourselves when an advance is made and we don't necessarily want to give. This is what Paul says, your body doesn't belong to yourself only, but also to your spouse. And that works both ways, both being willing to give above our natural desires, but also being willing to restrain desire with good grace. I'm definitely still learning in that regard. I won't go into any more detail than that, but there you go. These are things that we must learn and we must continue to pursue more godly lives in. Second, I'd say this, remember that your spouse cannot fill the God-shaped hole. I alluded to this briefly earlier. This is a conversation that we've had with a number of people outside the church who said, what do you mean my husband or wife isn't enough for me? Surely they should be everything to me. And we would say as Christians, no, God is everything to me. I absolutely adore Caroline. She is so much to me, but she cannot be God to me and she shouldn't be God to me. And if I look to her for what I should be looking to God for, it will be an unbearable burden on her and I will be disappointed because she isn't God and she won't be God and she can't be God. She doesn't have the capacity, and despite her many, many qualities, she is not as totally selflessly totally selflessly loving as God is in his selfless love. She is not as totally unconditional in her love for me as God is, and likewise me to her. So far short of that standard I fall. And so she can't look to me to be God in her life. She can't look to me to fill that desire for intimacy with God. And we mustn't put that burden on our spouses. I know that for me, and I've spoken with other men in this church who said the same, when I feel far from the Lord, one of the ways that I can reach out is in easier ways. It sometimes feels hard to come back to the Lord, but it's not so hard to reach out to Caroline for intimacy. I know I'm not alone in that, but that doesn't do any good to her or to me. Next then, Hebrews 13 says this, marriage should be honored by all and the marriage bed kept pure. Now, when you read that, probably your mind thinks, first of all about adultery and fidelity. And that's probably the most obvious reading of this. But actually, there are many ways in which the marriage bed can be impure. It's not just about whether we keep ourselves to our spouse. Just a couple of things on this, really. And first of all, to say that what we watch and what we consume and what we read really matters. A number of us will have come, and this is my own background, will have come from a background prior to marriage, or maybe even in some cases during marriage, of having been addicted to watching, reading things which were essentially pornographic, which were not good. Even if you haven't done that, there are billboards, there are adverts on TV which bombard you, and we can bring that into the bedroom, and we mustn't do. We'll come to renewing our mind in just a bit, but it's really important that it's kept pure. It's also really important that it's not a place of ongoing conflict. If you talk to people who work in marriage counselling, then pretty much after money, sex is top of the list in terms of causes of conflict in marriage. It's an area of battle for married couples. Now, it seems fairly normal that there'll be arguments about it. I don't dispute that. But if it's a regular source of conflict, I want to say to you, you're not alone in that. There are other people who have lived that, who have walked through that. Don't suffer in silence, but talk to people. We can put so much of a stigma on any kind of difficulties with sex in marriage that people feel like they can't talk to anybody about it. And particularly when you have every film ever and pretty much every book ever sort of talking about how as soon as a couple get together, it's all plain sailing and, they both absolutely love it all the time. And you can think, well, are we broken? Or surely this shouldn't be like this in the church, or maybe I'm making more of this than I should, and just sit there not asking for help. And I want to say to you, if that is the case, please ask for help. There are organizations out there, but there's also help within the church, a trusted Christian friend, or come and have a conversation with me or with Caroline. As your pastors, as your pastor and Caroline is my wife, But both of us having worked together as that, we are pastoral and we are approachable about this kind of thing. We're really, really happy to have an appropriate conversation and to help you to seek help in that regard. But please don't suffer in silence. And on that, I want to say, do find ways to talk appropriately about sex with others. We sort of flip-flop in culture between saying it's an intensely private matter that we should never talk about, and yet talking about it in a really crude and open manner with everybody. And as Christians, we can do something better than that. Maybe you feel like it's so intensely private that sex shouldn't be talked about at all outside the bedroom. But the trouble is that society around us never stopped talking about it. So if we don't ever talk about it as Christians, all we end up is imbibing the Hollywood view. That's not going to do us any good. And also that's actually unscriptural, because the scriptures teach about it in law, in letters. They tell stories of it, sometimes in remarkably graphic detail. They use it to talk about God's relationship with people. They celebrate it in poetry. And the Song of Songs, a whole book just dedicated to celebrating love and sexual love particularly. This doesn't look like something that should be kept in a corner, but nor is it to be dishonored with crude conversation at some work do. There's a right place for healthy conversation between Christians about sex. And I want to encourage you to seek it out and find it. Briefly, I want to say a couple of things for parents as well. A recurring theme throughout the Song of Songs is this phrase, do not awaken love until it's ready. For parents, we have a duty to think carefully about appropriate sex ed. It's complicated by an online world where so much is available at the fingertips. It's complicated by the school's mandates now to deliver sex education. I believe it's by year 6 at the latest. So how can we communicate important messages about safety and about the way things should be without awakening desires that children are not ready for? And my only top tip for this, and there will be others with more experience than me, but my top tip in this is make sure that sex isn't an awkward topic for them to raise. Be the first person to talk to your children about sex. There's considerable research that shows that the first person who speaks to a child about something is seen as something of an expert in that regard. Don't let it be the person who they sit next to at class who really knows nothing about it or who read about something online. Make sure it's you. And that means we need to get over our own awkwardness, because if we're awkward talking to them about it, they will pick up that awkwardness straight away and it'll be even harder for them. And it's not easy anyway. Find ways to take the intensity out of the conversation. For me, that's going on a walk. That takes the intensity out of being sort of side by side on the sofa or face to face across a table. But you'll have ways with your kids of taking the intensity out of that conversation. Do model the fullness of marriage as well. We talked earlier about taking a believing spouse, and there's this passage, isn't there, in 2 Corinthians 6, which says, don't be yoked with unbelievers. And we read at the end of 1 Corinthians 7 that a widow was free to marry, provided that the person she married was a believer. It's there in Scripture. But sometimes in conversations with our young people, they feel like it's just an arbitrary rule. The argument that I would always take is that when you're married to somebody, you need to be pulling in the same direction. If one of you is pursuing the Lord wholeheartedly and the other person isn't, you've got different frameworks for life. You're pulling apart. How are you going to strengthen each other, feed each other spiritually? How are you going to take good joint decisions about your children's upbringing and their spirituality? But that will all sound hollow if we're not actually living that out. So there's a challenge to those who are married to be yoked together spiritually. If you want your children to see the value of it, you want to be able to point to things in your life and say, you remember that decision we took and how we took it. You know how we sit and pray for half an hour the first thing every morning. Whatever it is in your marriage, model it to your children so that when you say to them, you can't be yoked with an unbeliever because, you know, how would this work and how would this work? They can see it lived out in practice. And lastly, teach some good habits. The top battle, this is me wearing my student pastor hat now, the top battle that I had with male students was encouraging them to leave their phones in a common area rather than taking them into their bedrooms at night, because it was a source of impurity to them. There was everything available at the touch of a button and no accountability. I would even encourage them, if it was possible, not to take their laptops into their bedrooms, even though that was often where they worked. And it would come at a cost. They'd say, it's so much harder to work in a busy environment. And we'd talk about it. We'd say, but it's worth it for the sake of purity. Now, you may say that ship's already sailed. We're in habits. Caroline and I have had to unlearn a number of habits around our mobile phone usage, actually. And it can be done. You can have that conversation with your kids and say, do you know what? Actually, I think this is important. We're going to try and learn at the same time. But don't take your mobile phones into your bedrooms, and encourage your kids not to do the same. And what you'll do is set in place good habits such that they're not subject to unaccountable temptation when they go on to more independent life. I'm going to stop there with advice for parents. There's more I could say there as well, but actually many of you are much more experienced parents than Caroline and I are. Some of that is just born out of seeing the other end of it as student ministers. I want to finish with 3 scriptures for all of us. The first one is from Matthew 6. The eye is the lamp of the body. If the eyes are dark, the whole body will be in darkness. I've always read this as a text about purity, but actually there's more than that. It lands in the middle of a text about not serving God and money. It's about single-hearted devotion. And John Piper interprets this way. He says, the good eye, so not the dark eye, but the opposite, the good eye sees God and his ways as the great treasure in life, not money. It's not just about, not desiring more wealth or whatever. It's about actually see God for who he is, much, much, much bigger and better and more valuable than money. And the same is true with us and sex. We're told by everything around us, by society, that sex is the ultimate thing that everybody wants. If you want proof of this, go onto the BBC News website and look at the difference between their top 10 latest stories and their top 10 most read stories. Any article at all about sex jumps up about 4 or 5 places when you go to most read, because people are just drawn to it. Oh yeah, this is the thing I need to read about. We need to hold to the truth that satisfaction in God is far higher, far better. And in fact, the perfect reality that we're destined for, Matthew 19, is a place with no sex at all. There won't be marriage and being given in marriage. And if people find that hard to believe, C.S. Lewis talks about it like a child who only knows chocolate and hears about sex, and they're like, oh, well, do couples eat chocolate while they have sex? No, there's something much better that displaces the chocolate. And in the same way, we know about sex and we say, well, surely there'll be sex in heaven. And what we don't know is the amazing joy of heaven, which will displace all of that, and in which, it just won't matter anymore. Secondly, then, do not be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. Romans 12. Our thoughts and views rarely stay static. They're always being influenced by what we hear and what we see. So keep bringing your mind back to God to be renewed. One utterly remarkable thing about 1 Corinthians 7 is that Paul talks about people's status as married, unmarried, decisions they're taking around that as something that should be answerable to our sense of calling, to our spirituality. For Paul, it's entirely plausible to give up sex and marriage forever for the sake of the kingdom of God. That's a totally countercultural way to see it all. But we need to come back to the scriptures and allow our minds to be renewed. And likewise, we need to come back to that framework. We were created by a loving and good God to enjoy the goodness of God and the goodness of his creation in good relationship with him. We need to renew our minds and remind ourselves that where there are limits that we see because the scriptures teach us to live like this, that we have a good and loving God who intends us to flourish. The last scripture I want to end with this, is from 1 Corinthians 10. Paul's been talking about eating and drinking and food sacrificed to idols and moral decisions around that. And he finishes with this: so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Do you know that our suffering can glorify God? Those who suffer well, you will probably have witnessed before now somebody who is sick and is suffering well, somebody who is grieving well, somebody who is dying well because their hope is in God. Certainly when I've witnessed that, it's humbling and it raises my eyes to God, and I find myself glorifying God because of how I see his character reflected in that person. Likewise, our celebration can glorify God. When we're lost in worship, I know people who their first experience of being drawn to God was being in a worship service and hearing this praise going up, and that celebration caused them to reach out for God. So our suffering can glorify God, our celebration can glorify God. If you find yourself feeling lonely and in lack because you want to be married and you're not, or your marriage isn't as sexual as you'd like it to be, or you're having to give more of yourself than you want to and you're not comfortable with it, our suffering can glorify God. If you are finding yourself fulfilled in this and you are grateful and you are living in a marriage in which you feel loved and appreciated and you're giving of yourself, our celebration can glorify God. Our purity of thought and life can point to God's holiness. Godly marriages can demonstrate God's self-sacrificial, self-giving love. Our sexual desires can remind us to anticipate the great joys of heaven ahead of us. So whether your desires are fulfilled, let that be for the glory of God. When they're not fulfilled, let that be for the glory of God. Whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, do it all for the glory of God. I want that to be our closing thought. How can we rule over our sexual desires so that we live for the glory of God?